The inspection yard was already tight with formation when the morning whistle sounded. Boots aligned in straight rows, beneath the watch of armed guards and administrative officers, moving down the line with clipboards. Supply workers, medical staff, and auxiliary personnel stood shoulder to shoulder under the cold light of an overcast sky, while inspection teams checked identification tags and clearance markings one by one. She stood midway in the line, pale but steady, her eyes fixed on the sealed crate row positioned along the far edge of the yard. The guards had already warned the group that delays would be punished, and the inspection had proceeded with mechanical efficiency until she swayed once and then collapsed forward onto the gravel. A guard stepped toward her immediately, voice sharp. "Stand up. No malingering during inspection." Another guard reached down as if to force her upright, but she did not respond. The line remained frozen. The supervising officer, stationed near the yard gate, turned at the disturbance and moved forward with measured pace. "Hold position," he ordered. The guards hesitated, but stepped back half a pace. He knelt briefly, not in concern but in assessment. "What happened?" he asked evenly. Her voice was faint, barely audible beneath the shuffle of boots and the rustle of paperwork. "The crates," she murmured. The officer leaned closer. "What about them?" Her eyes shifted toward the sealed row near the loading shed. "The numbers don't match," the nearest guard scoffed. "She's avoiding inspection." The officer did not respond immediately. Instead, he followed her gaze toward the crates marked for outbound distribution. Their stenciled codes appeared intact from a distance. "Explain," he said quietly. She struggled to draw breath. "The intake list. Yesterday. Medical units were issued 42. Mine, the sealed row holds more." The officer's expression remained controlled, but he looked again toward the supply line. The inspection clerk approached, uneasy. "Sir, shall we remove her from the queue?" The officer stood slowly. "No." The guards exchanged glances. The clerk shifted his weight. "Inspection must continue." The officer nodded once but did not look away from the crates. "It will." He turned back toward her. "You're certain?" She nodded faintly, eyes still fixed on the supply row. The wind moved lightly across the yard, lifting dust from the gravel while the rest of the line remained silent. The officer gestured for space. "Stand the guards back," he ordered. The command was brief but firm. The guards stepped away. The line did not move. For a moment, the routine of inspection faltered under the weight of a single irregularity, one that might have been dismissed as weakness, but now stood unresolved beneath the sealed markings of the outbound crates. The inspection office was small, lined with ledgers stacked along a narrow desk, and telegraph strips pinned beside a routing board. The officer entered first, the clerk following with the morning inspection sheet still in hand. She was brought in moments later, seated near the far wall, while a medic checked her breathing and withdrew quietly, once satisfied she could remain conscious. Outside, the inspection line had resumed under secondary supervision, but the officer closed the door to the office, isolating the conversation from the routine outside. "You said the intake numbers don't match the sealed row," he began evenly. She nodded once. The clerk placed the inspection sheet on the desk and unfolded the intake ledger beside it. "Yesterday's intake," the officer said, running a finger down the entries. 42 medical units received, logged at 1710. He shifted his attention to the outbound manifest pinned to the routing board. "Sealed crates listed for distribution, 48. The clerk leaned closer. "That could be a supplementary delivery." She shook her head slowly. There was no supplementary intake. The officer compared the signatures at the bottom of the intake record with those on the inspection clearance sheet. "These signatures were added this morning," he noted. The clerk frowned. "Routine validation." The officer looked again. The ink tone differed slightly from the previous day's entries. Different pen," he said quietly. The clerk hesitated. "Supplies rotate." The officer reached for the stamp codes aligned along the ledger margin. Clearance requires dual stamp confirmation. He examined the inspection sheet again. One stamp was present. The second was faint, partially smudged. She watched without speaking. The officer moved to the telegraph strips, pinned beside the routing board. Outbound confirmation received at 6:20, he read aloud. The clerk nodded. Bus standard routing. The officer studied the strip more closely. The spacing of the code appeared unusually uniform. He placed it beside an earlier strip from the previous day. The earlier strip showed subtle inconsistencies in rhythm. The new one was almost mechanical. "Who transmitted this?" he asked. The clerk shifted uneasily. "Relay confirmation." The officer looked toward her. "You noticed the crates?" She answered quietly. The markings were fresh. The officer returned to the ledger. "Fresh markings on sealed crates, added signatures, partial stamp confirmation, and relay routing received this morning." The clerk spoke quickly. "Inspection is complete unless discrepancies are proven." The officer closed the ledger slowly. "Inspection is interrupted until they are." Silence settled in the room. The clerk glanced toward the door, uncertain whether routine would resume or stall. The officer looked once more at the intake numbers, and then at the outbound manifest. The difference was small, 6 units. But in wartime logistics, small differences rarely occurred without cause. The supply warehouse stood at the far end of the yard, its wide wooden doors half open, beneath a strip of dull morning light. Rows of crates were stacked in uniform lines, each marked with intake numbers and distribution codes stenciled in black. The officer entered first, followed by the clerk carrying the intake ledger, and she walked a step behind, steady now but quiet. 2 warehouse guards watched from the entry post, uncertain whether to resume routine or wait for instruction. "Continue your positions," the officer told them calmly, and stepped toward the sealed medical row. The intake ledger lay open across a nearby crate, while he checked the markings on the first box. "Unit 41, he read. He moved to the next. 42, the clerk nodded. "Matches intake." The officer continued down the line. 43. He paused. The clerk leaned closer. "That shouldn't be there." The officer ran his hand across the stencil. The paint was slightly brighter than the earlier numbers. He checked the next crate. 44. She stepped forward. "Yesterday's intake ended at 42. The officer opened the ledger again and traced the intake entry. "Confirmed," he said. The clerk swallowed. "Perhaps supplemental storage." She shook her head. "Supplemental units are logged separately." The officer gestured for the guards. "Open 43. The lid came loose with a short crack. Inside were medical kits packed tightly in canvas wrap, identical to the logged intake units. The officer examined the internal packing stamp. "Issued from the same depot." The clerk shifted uneasily. "Then why not recorded?" The officer moved to the adjacent row, marked for fuel allocation. He checked the ledger again. Fuel intake, 32 drums. He counted the sealed barrels. 35 stood in the row. 3 unlogged, he noted. The clerk began to protest but stopped. The officer knelt beside one barrel and inspected the seal. "Tampered and resealed," he observed. She moved closer. "Yesterday's transfer list accounted for every drum." The officer stood slowly. The discrepancy was no longer confined to medical units. The guards exchanged glances but remained silent. He checked the warehouse ledger pinned to the wall beside the loading bay schedule. "Outbound assignments prepared for this afternoon." The clerk looked at the routing line. "These extra units were scheduled for movement." The officer turned toward her. "You said the markings were fresh." She nodded once. "They weren't part of yesterday's intake." The officer closed the ledger. The air inside the warehouse felt heavier now. The orderly rows no longer routine but altered. He signaled for the guards again. "Seal the additional units for inspection." The clerk hesitated. "Outbound schedule." The officer answered evenly. "Is suspended until reconciliation." The guards moved to isolate the crates marked 43 and 44, and the 3 additional fuel drums. She watched without speaking as the altered inventory was set aside. The warehouse, once predictable in its uniformity, now held quiet irregularities that routine had nearly carried forward without notice. Beyond the main warehouse floor stood a narrower corridor leading to the restricted storage room, its iron latch secured with a clearance seal that should have required dual authorization to open. The officer stopped before it and checked the logbook mounted beside the door. The last recorded entry was from 3 days earlier. Routine inventory balance. The clerk flipped through the intake ledger again. No restricted allocation since then, he said quietly. She stood beside the officer, all eyes on the seal. Yet the additional units were scheduled for outbound movement. The officer examined the seal more closely. The wax appeared intact at first glance, but a faint line ran along its edge, as though lifted and pressed back into place. He turned to the guard posted at the corridor entrance. "Who accessed this room?" The guard shifted uneasily. "No recorded entry since the last audit." The officer nodded once. "Open it." The guard hesitated. "Authorization?" The officer answered without raising his voice. "Inspection override." The latch released with a short metallic click. Inside, the room was dim, its single overhead bulb casting uneven light across stacked containers and metal shelving. Unlike the main warehouse rows, these crates were not marked for standard distribution. The officer stepped in slowly, the clerk following with the ledger. She paused at the threshold, scanning the arrangement. "These weren't logged," she said quietly. The officer moved toward the nearest container and brushed dust from its surface. The stenciling matched the additional medical units from the main floor, but beneath the outer marking was a second imprint, faint but visible. "Dual coding," he noted. The clerk leaned closer. "Outer marking for medical supply, inner for equipment." The officer opened the container. Beneath a layer of wrapped bandages lay compact signal components wired to small battery packs. She stepped forward. "Signal relay devices." The officer checked another crate. This one contained coiled wiring fitted with clamp mechanisms. "Bridge contact fittings," he said evenly. The clerk looked from the ledger to the crate. "These were never recorded." The officer turned toward the shelving along the far wall. A narrow box lay tucked behind standard storage bins. He retrieved it and opened the lid. Inside rested a compact transmitter identical in design to those used in field relay stations. She watched in silence as the pattern emerged. Additional medical units, surplus fuel drums, and concealed signal equipment, all positioned within restricted storage, but absent from recorded intake. The guard at the doorway shifted his stance. "Sir?" The officer closed the box and replaced it on the shelf. "Seal the room again," he instructed. When the clerk glanced toward the ledger, "Outbound movement was scheduled this afternoon." The officer nodded. "Not anymore." The restricted storage room, once an afterthought in routine inventory checks, now held evidence that the discrepancies were deliberate. The officer stepped back into the corridor while the guard secured the latch. The wax seal, repressed into place, concealed the same quiet alteration that had passed unnoticed until routine faltered. The command desk overlooked the inspection yard from a raised wooden platform, giving a clear view of the warehouse doors and the outbound loading lanes beyond. By mid-morning, routine had begun to reassert itself outside. Guards returning to post, supply workers awaiting instruction. But inside the command space, the atmosphere remained taut. The officer placed the intake ledger, the inspection sheet, and the restricted storage log side by side across the desk. The clerk stood opposite. She uncertain whether to prepare outbound confirmation or suspend the day's schedule entirely. "Outbound shipments are due at 1400, the clerk said cautiously. "If delayed, Central Command will request justification." The officer nodded, but did not respond immediately. She stood near the window, looking toward the yard where the isolated crates remained under guard. "Yesterday's shift patterns changed," she said quietly. The officer glanced toward her. Explain." She stepped closer to the desk. "Warehouse shift rotated early. Evening intake arrived before verification was completed." The clerk frowned. "That's not unusual," she continued. "Signal interference was reported near the loading bay last night." The officer turned toward the telegraph strips pinned beside the routing board. The uniform spacing of the morning's confirmation message remained evident. "You believe the shift change and the relay pattern are linked?" he asked. She nodded once. "Movement during verification creates opportunity." The clerk hesitated. "There is no proof." The officer looked down at the ledger again. The additional medical units, the surplus fuel drums, the concealed equipment in restricted storage. "Proof begins with discrepancy," he said evenly. Outside, the yard bell rang once, signaling preparation for outbound staging. The clerk shifted his weight. "If shipments are halted, the delay must be recorded." The officer reached for the outbound schedule and closed it. "Record the delay." The clerk inhaled sharply. "Command will question the override." The officer's voice remained calm. "They should." He turned toward the window again. Workers moved in routine patterns, unaware of the altered inventory awaiting movement. She followed his gaze. "If the altered units move, the timing completes." The officer considered the yard for a moment longer. "Then they do not move," he said. The clerk opened his mouth to respond but stopped. The decision had already been made. The officer picked up the inspection sheet and drew a line through the outbound authorization. "Outbound shipment suspended pending audit." He signed beneath it. The act was simple, but it shifted responsibility from routine to command. Outside, the bell fell silent as guards received new instruction to hold the loading lanes. The officer placed the signed sheet beside the ledger and looked once more at the telegraph strip with its mechanical rhythm. The risk was no longer whether the delay would be justified, but whether routine would have concealed what discrepancy had begun to reveal. The depot floor was cleared of routine movement within minutes of the officer's signed suspension. Guards repositioned along the loading lanes, while workers were instructed to remain at their stations until reassignment was confirmed. The isolated crates from the warehouse stood under watch near the central platform, their markings no longer routine, but flagged for review. The officer stepped onto the depot floor with the clerk beside him, the intake ledger still open. She followed, observing the arrangement of outbound rows now held in place. "We begin with separation," the officer said evenly. He gestured toward the sealed medical units beyond 42 and the additional fuel drums identified earlier. "Remove them from outbound staging." Guards moved quickly, lifting the extra crates and barrels onto a separate pallet under direct supervision. The clerk recorded each transfer with careful notation. The officer then turned to the remaining outbound rows. "We're audit by sequence," he instructed. Workers began opening containers under guard presence, verifying contents against the intake ledger line by line. The process was deliberate and slower than routine loading, but the yard remained silent as each crate was checked. She moved between rows, comparing internal packing with recorded entries. "Unit 38 verified," she called quietly. The clerk noted the confirmation. The officer continued down the line, but pausing only when irregular packing appeared. One container held additional wiring tucked beneath standard supply wraps. The officer lifted it free. "Not logged," he said. The clerk recorded the finding without comment. The audit proceeded across the depot floor. Medical, fuel, and auxiliary equipment verified in sequence. The rhythm of routine had been replaced by methodical scrutiny. Workers watched as guards secured each irregular item identified during inspection. She paused beside the pallet, holding the surplus fuel drums. "3 unlogged," she said again, confirming earlier observation. The officer nodded. "Mark them for isolation." The clerk placed a notation beside their entry. As the audit moved toward completion, the officer signaled for a final cross-check of the restricted storage inventory. The guard responsible brought forward the sealed logbook, now reopened under inspection override, and the officer compared its entries with the isolated crates already removed from outbound staging. The pattern aligned. Additional units recorded nowhere, scheduled for movement under routine timing. He closed the logbook slowly. "Outbound remains suspended," he said. The clerk hesitated only briefly before recording the continuation of the hold order. Around them, the depot floor stood quiet. No loading, no outbound preparation, only verification. The controlled audit had replaced routine entirely, by isolating what had been concealed within standard movement. The officer looked toward the pallet of irregular items now secured at the center of the depot. Their presence confirmed that discrepancy had not been accidental. The loading bay, once expected to move in steady outbound rhythm, now stood under guarded silence as the controlled audit reached its final stage. Workers remained at assigned stations, but their movements were slowed by watchful supervision. The isolated pallet of irregular crates and fuel drums rested near the central platform, marked clearly for further review. The officer stood at the edge of the bay beside the clerk, observing the suspended lanes. She moved along the perimeter, scanning the arrangement of containers awaiting reassignment. The stillness held until a forklift operator approached the outer lane with unexpected urgency. "Scheduled transfer," he said, gesturing toward the isolated pallet. The clerk frowned. "There is no active schedule." The operator hesitated, then attempted to steer the lift toward the pallet regardless. A guard stepped forward. "Hold position." The operator stopped briefly, then tried to pivot the lift toward an adjacent lane where outbound crates remained under review. The officer raised a hand. "Stand down." The operator froze. Another worker moved toward the restricted storage corridor, carrying a clipboard. The guard at the corridor entrance blocked his path. "No access," the worker insisted quietly. "Secondary authorization." The officer stepped closer. "Produce it." The clipboard was presented. The signature line appeared complete, but the officer recognized the same altered pen tone noted earlier. He returned it without comment. "Invalid." The tension within the bay shifted. Two additional workers approached the isolated pallet from opposite sides, their movements no longer routine. She noticed the coordinated timing immediately. "They're moving together," she said quietly. The officer signaled to the guards. The workers paused. Then one attempted to lift a crate from the pallet manually. The guard intervened, preventing removal. The crate shifted slightly, revealing a thin wire tucked beneath its base, previously concealed by standard wrapping. The officer knelt and lifted the crate carefully. Beneath it lay a compact signal component identical to those found in restricted storage. The clerk inhaled sharply. They intended to move it under outbound cover. The second worker stepped back, glancing toward the corridor. The guards closed in, preventing further movement. The forklift operator attempted to reverse the lift, but another guard stepped forward to block its path. The bay, once governed by routine, now held visible coordination that had broken under scrutiny. She moved closer to the crate base. "This was staged for transfer," she said. The officer stood and looked toward the workers now held under guard. "Remove them from the floor." The guards escorted the individuals away without resistance. The clerk recorded the seizure of the concealed component. Around them, the remaining workers stood silent, aware that the routine flow of loading had nearly concealed deliberate movement. The officer signaled for the isolated pallet to remain under full guard, while the audit findings were consolidated. The clash had been brief. No raised voices, no overt force, but its intent was clear. The attempt to move the altered cargo during inspection had exposed coordination that routine alone would have carried forward unnoticed. By late afternoon, the inspection yard had been cleared and reorganized for assembly. Personnel from the warehouse, Loading bay. An inspection line stood in ordered formation beneath the same overcast sky that had witnessed the morning collapse. The isolated pallet of irregular crates and seized components was positioned at the center of the yard, no longer hidden among routine inventory, but displayed as evidence of discrepancy. The officer stepped forward from the command platform, to the clerk beside him with the intake ledger and inspection sheet. She stood slightly behind, watching the gathered personnel. The yard was silent except for the wind moving lightly across the gravel. This morning's inspection was interrupted, the officer began evenly. A discrepancy was reported. He gestured toward the pallet. Guards removed the covering canvas, revealing the additional medical units, surplus fuel drums, concealed wiring, and signal components recovered from restricted storage and the loading bay. A murmur moved through the formation but quickly subsided. The officer held up the intake ledger. 42 medical units were logged yesterday. 48 were prepared for movement. He placed the ledger on the crate before lifting the inspection sheet. Dual stamp clearance was incomplete. The clerk displayed the altered signature lines for those closest to see. The officer then turned toward the telegraph strips, pinned to a portable board brought from the office. Routing confirmation received this morning showed mechanical spacing inconsistent with manual transmission. The assembly remained still. The officer placed the strip beside the ledger. These irregularities were not accidental. He looked toward the guards who had intercepted the attempted transfer in the loading bay. They stepped forward briefly to present the concealed component recovered beneath the crate. The officer continued. Movement of unlogged cargo was attempted during audit. The formation shifted subtly. The earlier accusation of malingering replaced by visible evidence of manipulation. He did not raise his voice. Inspection was interrupted because discrepancy required verification. He gestured once toward her. The initial report was correct. No applause followed, while only the quiet adjustment of understanding. The officer lowered the inspection sheet and signaled for the evidence to be secured again. Guards replaced the canvas over the pallet. The clerk recorded the assembly statement. The yard remained silent, but the order within it had shifted, from routine compliance to confirmed review. Months later, the depot no longer operated under the same unquestioned routine that had governed its movements on the day inspection was halted. The yard still filled each morning with orderly rows of medical crates, fuel drums, and auxiliary equipment awaiting distribution. But the procedures guiding their verification had changed. Intake markings were now applied only after dual confirmation from both warehouse record and inspection log, ensuring that no single authorization could advance cargo into outbound staging. Telegraph routing no longer depended on a single received confirmation. Each message was reviewed against prior transmission patterns before influencing departure schedules. The restricted storage room, once opened only during periodic inventory checks, became part of the standard audit cycle, its contents reviewed alongside the main supply floor. The irregular medical units and concealed signaling components recovered during the earlier inspection were documented in sector training reports and used to demonstrate how minor discrepancies could mask deliberate alteration. The loading bay where attempted transfer had occurred adopted revised staging rules, preventing any unverified crate from entering outbound lanes until its intake history was confirmed. The officer, now reassigned to oversee logistics compliance across the corridor, she returned periodically to observe the updated procedures in operation. She remained assigned to audit review, examining intake ledgers and telegraph strips with practiced attention. Her initial report, once treated as disruption, had become precedent. The clerk who had hesitated at the suspension order now initiated verification reviews before each departure cycle. Workers followed the revised sequence without complaint, aware that routine alone no longer defined readiness. The yard bell still rang to signal preparation, but each departure now followed confirmation rather than assumption. From the command platform, the revised protocol appeared ordinary in its consistency. Yet its presence ensured that discrepancy would not pass unnoticed. The depot continued its function within the wider effort, but its discipline reflected a lesson learned quietly. Inspection, interrupted for evidence, strengthens, rather than weakens, the system it governs. War moves on schedules, but safety depends on scrutiny. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Clara at War for more WW2 mission dramas where vigilance, discipline, and timing shape outcomes. Sometimes the system survives because someone stops it.